I want to kind of go back to that where we were talking about saying no to disrespect or burnout is not self-centered. It's a way of caring for your emotional, physical, and spiritual health so you can love better. I think a lot of times, as husband and wife in ministry, you have to be careful with that because you do have to say no at some point.
Yeah.
Because you can get to the point where you're serving or you're doing this and you're doing that, and you can get burnt out. And I think that, just reading that of knowing that it's not self-centered, helps me tremendously, because some people, like Dan can say, like he said earlier, I think on our last episode, some people can serve, and it not affect them at all. While others, they can serve, but they can overserve, and, it's detrimental on the inside where, you don't recognize it. But I think sometimes I like the fact that if your spouse or something like that, you can love better if you have to say no, and it's not self-centered.
This week on Marriage, Life, and More, we're going to be talking about misconceptions with boundaries in marriage. We'll be back to get into that right after this. Welcome to Marriage, Life, and More. This is a podcast about marriage, Bible, and book studies. We interview people with inspiring stories. I'm Daniel Moore, your host. My wife, Michelle Moore, over here.
Hey.
Beautiful co-host with me this week as we're going to go through another episode here. Thank you guys for joining us. If you're not familiar with our show, you can check out our website at www.marriagelifeandmore.com. Our platforms are there, YouTube and Rumble links. We're also on the Christian podcasting app Edify and on your Alexa and Google smart devices. You can also visit us on social, on Facebook, X, and Instagram at CT Gap Online. If you're a fan of our show, please subscribe. Feel free to leave a comment on our platforms, give us a thumbs up or a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and we'd be grateful to you for doing that. Well, last week we started talking about boundaries in marriage, and we went through a lot of definitions last week of different types of boundaries that are usually put into place in a biblical marriage: emotional, physical, spiritual, and relational. So if you haven't listened to that episode, you might want to go back and check that out before you start out this week's episode. This week, we're going to continue on deeper into that conversation on boundaries. And this week, we're going to be talking about misconceptions about boundaries in marriage. So as we get started this week, talking about boundaries, the first question we want to ask, I guess, is why do many couples avoid setting boundaries? Well, many couples avoid setting boundaries in marriage because they fear it's going to create conflict, seem unloving, or make them appear selfish. Some worry that expressing needs or limits will upset their spouse or damage their relationship, so they stay silent to keep the peace. But that peace is often temporary and just surface level. Others may not even realize boundaries are healthy. They confuse boundaries with emotional walls or rejection, especially if they grew up in homes where their needs weren't respected. In some cases, one spouse may feel guilty for asserting themselves, especially if they were taught that love means always giving in or sacrificing. Unfortunately, avoiding boundaries often leads to resentment, burnout, and disconnection, because unspoken expectations and repeated violations of emotional or relational space quietly erodes trust and intimacy over time. So the second question we have this week as we start: can boundaries exist in a loving, selfless marriage? Yes, boundaries can, and actually they absolutely should exist in a marriage.
Yes.
They should exist in a loving, selfless marriage because they are not about keeping love out, they are about protecting it. A truly selfless marriage doesn't mean ignoring your own needs or allowing harmful behavior. It means loving your spouse in a way that honors both of you as whole, respected individuals. Boundaries help define what is healthy, respectful, and safe within the relationship, which creates space for trust, vulnerability, and deeper connection to grow. Far from being barriers to love, boundaries are actually a form of love. They say that I care about us enough to be honest about what I need and to respect what you need too. In this way, boundaries support, not hinder, a selfless, Christ-centered marriage. So I know as we talk about boundaries, a lot of people like to probably cringe when they hear that word because they just don't look at boundaries, I don't think, in a way that they probably should. A lot of people, they misunderstand boundaries. They assume that they're signs of rejection or selfishness or even emotional distance. But in reality, healthy boundaries strengthen a marriage because they protect intimacy, respect, and emotional safety. So we're going to talk about a few misconceptions here this week about boundaries in marriage and the truths that connect those together. So the very first misconception here that we're going to talk about, and this is probably one of the biggest things that people think about boundaries whenever they think about putting a boundary in place, they look at it as a wall. And so the very first misconception here is that boundaries are walls that keep my spouse out. Why don't you give us the truth on that one?
Boundaries are not walls. They're doors with doorknobs on the inside. Healthy boundaries don't shut your spouse out. They invite in safe, respectful connection. Walls say, stay away forever. Boundaries say, here's how we can connect in a way that honors both of us. For example, setting a boundary like, I need 20 minutes to cool off before we talk, isn't shutting your spouse out. It's protecting the conversation from becoming hurtful. That's so good.
Have you ever felt like that a boundary was a wall in our relationship?
Yeah, I did. And when we first got married, it definitely was. And we were talking about this, boundaries didn't even, for me, I never even thought of a boundary, to be quite honest. As we talk about boundaries, like last week, this week, we're talking about next week, this is just not something that I really thought much about until later on in our marriage, and which is a healthy thing to learn about at the very beginning, to be actually honest.
Yeah. Well, the biggest thing is when you look at a boundary like a wall versus just a boundary that's there for a safe reason, is whenever you actually have a wall in place, you end up like we did at one point in our marriage.
Yeah.
Because that wall was put there to completely create a division between me and you for a reason.
Yeah.
There were things that I did not want you to know about me. There were things I did not want to be honest with you about.
Same here.
In communication.
Same.
And you had the same issues on your side of the wall.
Yeah.
And so here at the very beginning, you describe boundaries as doors with doorknobs on the inside. And that's a very significant thing to say, because what that actually is speaking is, I have this boundary in place because this is my safety mechanism.
Right.
This is my safe space.
And you're the one that can open it.
It's not because that I'm locking you out.
Right.
But when I'm ready and I'm wanting to go ahead and communicate through this and figure this issue out or the situation, I will open that door. And then we will usher in this communication back and forth to resolve and come to a resolution to this issue.
I was thinking of, when I was reading this, boundaries are walls that keep my spouse out. It reminds me of a time where I was reading a book where Havilah Cunnington was talking about, and I can't remember if it was a book or if it was just a study that she did online, but she talked about gates. And the gates was, actually a gate. A gate was to her backyard. She allowed anybody to come through that back gate when she opened the gate. Otherwise, she didn't let anybody in. It was her boundary. And I learned so much through that, because we were going through a situation with some family members, our kids. And, sometimes you have to set those boundaries and you have to shut that gate. And it's healthy. It's healthy for the person that opens a gate and shuts a gate. And I think that is the same as in marriage. You have that boundary that you have to do. And so anytime I hear anyone talk about boundaries, I automatically go to my gate. Am I allowing my gate to be open to this, or if I'm shutting my gate? Because if I shut my gate, I'm not going to allow it to affect me whatsoever. And it's not going to go there. But if I open my gate, then I feel safe. I feel secure with this being allowed to come into my backyard. And I'm going to allow it to be in my backyard. But that doesn't mean at some point in time that person may end up back out on my gate.
Yeah.
So it's protecting yourself. And the same thing in marriage. You have to, you do have to protect it, but you have to it's not a wall for you just to block everything out because, again, that's what you did.
Yeah.
That's what I did. And you just can't do that. You have to be able to allow someone in that space, especially as your spouse.
Yeah.
But it has to be a safe space.
Yeah. When you was talking about that situation that happened in our family, when that gate was closed, look what happened.
Yeah.
Over time, it actually resolved itself.
Yeah.
We got to a point where we were able to communicate.
God. I mean, God was, when I shut that gate, God took care of it. It wasn't like.
It wasn't immediately.
Yeah.
It took several months.
Yes.
But it still came back around.
But I knew I had to shut that gate.
Yeah.
And so it has to be a healthy one.
Yeah. And so just always keep in your mind, whenever situations come up that triggers you that automatically wants you to shut down and automatically wants you to quit communicating with that person, just make sure that you're not building a wall. You have to give room for God to move, first of all. You need to start praying about that situation and start opening that door for God to come in and start doing what He's going to do in that to help you get ready for when that time comes that you can open that door from the inside with your doorknob and you can allow that situation to come back in. At that point, you can discuss it hopefully in a safe manner with that person and come to a resolution.
Well, I like the fact that it said, setting the boundary, like I need 20 minutes to cool off. One, communication, and a boundary lets you know, hey, I need some time. Let me cool off. But that communication plays such a big part.
Comes back into everything.
Oh, yes, all the way.
Yeah, can't be married without communication.
Yes.
It's just impossible. It's very, and even if it is possible, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
If it's not there. So that's the first misconception that we just want to blow out of the water here is that boundaries, they're not a wall. They shouldn't be a wall. You might be making it a wall, but you should not be doing that.
That is correct.
Make sure that you keep that as Michelle described it. I like how that analogy was, as a gate, where it's just as a door, however you want to look at that. Make sure you keep it that way, so that way when the time comes, you can resolve that conflict and that issue and take care of that. So the second misconception here about boundaries is that they're selfish. Boundaries, in truth, they are actually stewardship. They're not really selfishness. Saying no to disrespect or burnout is not self-centered. It's a way of caring for your emotional, physical, and spiritual health so that you can love better. Jesus set boundaries regularly. He withdrew from crowds. He said no to demands and didn't let others define his mission. Boundaries are actually a Christ-like act of love and clarity. They are not selfishness.
And what's funny is Havla, and I think that's the reason why the gate thing has always stuck with me, is because exactly how Jesus set boundaries.
Yep.
And that's biblical.
Yep, it is very biblical. But when you start setting up a boundary to a situation where another person is involved, more often than not, that person on the other side of that door does probably look at it like you're being selfish because you just don't want to enter into this conflict right now. It's all about you. It's all being centered around you. But in all reality, just remember as spouses, if you guys have a disagreement or you have a situation that comes up that might cause some conflict where one of the spouses has to step back for a moment and put up that barrier temporarily, at the very beginning of that, make sure you respect that.
Yeah.
Even in the heat of the moment, when you're all mad at each other and upset and everything, you still need to understand each other enough to make sure that you give that space. And honestly, both of you at that point really need to be setting up a boundary at that point. It shouldn't just be one spouse setting the boundary because both sides of that need to have a boundary there to make sure that you don't overstep each other's space. And, even in marriage ministry, this is something that with our marriage ministry that we're involved in, there's a model that's used in that. And basically it's kind of sort of the way that you're talking about the gate in your backyard, but each spouse has their own yard. And then you also have your own safe space. and you don't cross into the shared yard until each of you are ready and available to do that in a safe manner. Then you cross over into the shared spaces.
And one can't pull the other one into it.
Right. It has to be a mutual agreement between both parties. And that's how you have a safe marriage that where you can cohabit and love each other unconditionally like you should and resolve conflicts.
And not only in that, when they're in their yards, they are focusing and working, I wouldn't say focusing, but they are working on themselves with a relationship with Christ, because Christ is at the top.
Yeah.
So when you're completely worked in with God, then you come down into that yard and you are both filled with love with Christ, that the fact that you can work through those and see the other person's point, whether you guys agree or not, you can work through those issues.
Yeah. And if you see that model, I'm glad you brought that up, because that model is represented by circles.
Yes.
So the husband has a circle, the spouse has a circle, the yard in the middle is a piece of each circle, and then a space in between where you both would cross into when you come into it equally. And God's circle is in all of those circles. Yep. His crosses over into every aspect of that relationship.
It is a great
really,
model.
Really neat to, when you see that, it gives you a whole different outlook and aspect on marriage and how boundaries should work.
Yeah.
And
so
how they should work in a consistent way.
Yeah.
So when your spouse is setting up a boundary, don't automatically fly off on the "you're just being selfish" tangent, because that's not really. It might be a case in some situations if it's an ungodly type of marriage where God's not in the middle of it. But if you guys are allowing God in there shouldn't be any selfishness involved with that.
I want to kind of go back to that where we were talking about saying no to disrespect or burnout is not self-centered. It's a way of caring for your emotional, physical, and spiritual health so you can love better. I think a lot of times, as husband and wife in ministry, you have to be careful with that, because you do have to say no at some point.
Yeah.
Because you can get to the point where you're serving or you're doing this and you're doing that, and you can get burnt out. And I think that, just reading that, of knowing that it's not self-centered, helps me tremendously, because some people, like Dan can say, like he said earlier, I think on our last episode, some people can serve, and it not affect them at all. Why others, they can serve, but they can overserve, and it's detrimental on the inside where you don't recognize it. But I think sometimes I like the fact that if your spouse or something like that, you can love better if you have to say no, and it's not self-centered.
Yeah.
I really, really like that.
When you're consumed with everything else around you, you don't leave that space to love each other.
Yeah.
If you can keep all of that stuff from consuming you, that leaves room for that love to operate.
Yeah. Sorry, people. I had to do that. Dan and I are having a day trying to record. This has just been so funny. We had our dogs bark earlier, but that's probably going to be cut out. But we just,
We'll leave the motorcycle in there.
You're going to hear me say that. But I just like the fact of that, because I think sometimes, you have to, and go back to the yard, you have to work on yourself.
Yep.
And if you're over-serving and you're not taking care of yourself and your internal relationship with Christ, it's going to reflect in your marriage as well. You may be short with someone, or you're short with your husband or something. You need to pay attention to that. And I think sometimes we love God and we want to be doing things for God, that you have to be careful with that. And sometimes setting that boundary, you have to remember you're not being selfish, and you're not going to let that person down that you're serving for or anything like that, or what you're doing, because you have to take care of your internal self.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot of there's marriages out there that have fell apart, even with pastors, because they poured everything into their church and their congregation and neglected their marriage.
Yep.
And you would think if somebody's serving God in that way, how could they ever have that happen? But it happens.
It does happen.
It does. You have to be careful with that. The third misconception, if I love someone, I shouldn't need boundaries. So tell us about that one.
The truth is, love without boundaries becomes enabling, codependent, or even harmful. True love includes truth and grace. Setting boundaries like, please don't yell at me when we argue, is not unloving. It's inviting healthier communication. Without boundaries, one spouse can begin to dominate or disrespect the other without realizing it and damaging the relationship. Boy, I go back to the earlier years of our marriage.
Yeah.
And this really explains it.
Yeah.
Like, we yelled at each other at times, and it isn't, when it says, please don't yell at me when we argue, is not unloving.
Yeah.
We weren't in a healthy boundary marriage at all.
Mm-mm.
So yelling at you was me like, this is what I have to say. You're gonna take what I have to say, and this is gonna be my way or the highway.
Yeah.
So I really like the fact that it's inviting healthier communication, which we don't do now. But
Right. Yeah.
I can't even remember the last time we've yelled at each other.
It's been a long time. Thank goodness. I don't want you punching me.
God.
That happens.
Hey,
too
I
often.
didn't say that. Listen to him.
I had to get you on that one.
Oh, you did. That was a good one.
But yeah, we have to remember that even because we have a deep love for each other does not mean that we're never going to have an argument.
That's right.
I mean, it is very possible for some day for something to happen.
Yeah.
And with the pressures of life, the pressures of family, work, whatever it may be, everybody deals with baggage.
And we do disagree.
Yeah, and we have disagreements, and sometimes disagreements can get elevated.
Yes.
And you can raise your voices, you can say some snippy things that you regret later. So just because you are fully, madly in love with somebody, don't take that to say that, oh, well, because of that, I don't have to set a boundary with you.
Yeah.
Because we're still human.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter how much we love each other. We still have those human instincts and those human attributes. And there are days that we're going to wake up on the wrong side of the bed and something's going to flip that trigger and it's going to be a bad day.
Yeah.
And so you have to always make sure that you conscientiously keep those boundaries in place so that when that does happen, then you have a process of how to process all of that through and then get together with the communication once you're both ready and fix that problem and not let it go on all day long.
Right.
And so, love does it, being truth and grace, that's so true with love, because if we truly love someone, then we're going to be truthful and upfront and honest with that person.
Yes.
And then we're also going to give them the most grace, because that's the person that we love the most in our life, besides God. And so we should have the most abundance of grace for our spouse over anyone, to make sure that that relationship stays where it should be. So if you're one of these couples that's just so madly in love and you drool over each other all the time, and you've probably just been married a year and you haven't figured it all out yet, because
still need those boundaries.
Yeah, you still need those boundaries in place, and just make sure that they're good, healthy ones.
Yes.
Biblically. The fourth misconception: if we need boundaries, our marriage must be weak. And I can see people thinking that. But the truth of it is, all healthy marriages require boundaries, even the strong ones, and especially the strong ones.
Yeah.
Boundaries are a sign of maturity, not weakness. They show that both partners are willing to communicate honestly, take responsibility for their actions, and respect each other's needs.
Good.
The absence of boundaries often leads to confusion, resentment, or burnout, while the presence of boundaries fosters truth and peace. And this one here, I think, is...
That's so good.
Especially from a guy's side of things, when we look at love, we look at marriage and that kind of thing, a lot of guys are more on the manly side of things. They're like, I don't need no boundaries. We're going to be a man. We'll figure this stuff out, and we want to come in like a bull in a
not
china
reading
closet.
Directions.
Exactly. So this would be, something that we as men even have to remember, that just because we love our spouses and give into the womanly things sometimes, or whatever you want to describe that, doesn't mean we're weak. We give up our man card. That means nothing like that at all. In all reality, Michelle is thankful that I have my boundaries in place, just as I am that she has hers in place, because it shows that we're both willing to work on our marriages regardless of what may come up. We have those things in place to make sure that if issues happen, we can work through those. And so I think it's super important, even just from the aspect of looking at it from the outside, that I'm glad that you have a boundary in place that's not going to allow something to come in and wreck our marriage because of something I say or do. And I think you look at it the same way
Yep.
from the other side. So it shows that we are being intentional in our marriage. We are intentionally trying to make sure that those things are in place so that we don't resent each other in the long run, or we don't have confusion in what we both think or whatever. We're on the same page with everything that's going on within our relationship, our family, and our home, and we're not getting burned out on each other.
Yeah.
Because that's in a marriage, that's the last thing you want to happen is that burnout.
Yeah.
You're living together the rest of your life. So you have to make sure you understand how to keep this together. And so I think that whenever we have these boundaries in place, then, it creates that space of trust where I can trust you, you can trust me, that we're going to handle things the way we should. And then that keeps the peace in our home.
So good.
So the number 5 misconception, boundaries mean I don't trust my spouse. What's the truth on that one?
Boundaries help build trust, not destroy it. Healthy boundaries clarify expectations, reduce miscommunication, and prevent unnecessary hurt. For example, saying, let's agree not to share private arguments with friends is a boundary that protects. For example, saying, let's agree not to share private arguments with friends is a boundary that protects trust, not suspicion. And it's so good. That is very good.
Yeah.
And I think, just like how that example of, you might not think that's a boundary and just say, hey, let's just not do that. But in all reality, when you are setting those are boundaries.
Yep. Those are things that you don't want to cross over.
Yeah.
Because the moment that you do, if you tell me that, if you say, let's not share these private arguments, and then I go do it, what's that going to make you think about me?
Oh.
You're going to lose my trust in me.
Yep.
And so then what's going to happen after that? You're going to question, second guess in the future. If I tell Daniel this boundary, is he going to keep it or not?
Yeah.
Can I even trust him to, do what I request? And it would be the same way with me. If something happened on the opposite side of that.
Now, I do think that nobody's perfect.
Right.
And boundaries are set, but once in a great while, it's going to happen, and that's where the grace comes in.
Yeah.
And
I think as spouses, I know for myself, and I think you feel the same way, if you know each other well enough as a spouse, we know when we're truly repentant.
Yeah.
So I think there comes a point in your relationship and in your marriage where if I say, hey, I'm really sorry about this, I shouldn't have done that, I'm not going to do it again, then you're going to know if I'm being legit with that or not.
Yeah.
And so that's going to build that trust back. And then, of course, as you set another boundary in the future and I keep that boundary,
that trust gets built.
That's going to start building that trust back, stronger again. And so just because you put a boundary there does not mean that you don't trust each other. It just means, again, that you're trying to protect your marriage. You're trying to protect your relationship. And that does build trust because it's really an honesty thing for the most part, because if you tell me to do something and I say I'm going to do it and then I follow through, that's what builds trust.
Yes.
And so the more often that happens, then your trust becomes stronger and stronger in that person. And so that's what these boundaries do.
Yeah.
You set them in place to protect your personal relationship between you and your spouse and then the outside world. And then when you guys keep those boundaries, you keep going through those and not breaking that trust, then that builds that trust between each other and it just helps that marriage to flourish. And so it's definitely, if you've got that mindset that if I set this boundary, my spouse is going to think I don't trust them.
And your boundaries can be anything. Like it can be, hey, we're going to set a boundary. We're not, going to spend this much money. We're going to set this much aside, or, hey, you're not going to go do this without me. Or, it could be anything. But once you set those, make sure that you both are on the same page and everything, because again, it's the trust and honesty.
Yep. And the final misconception to wrap up the episode for this week on boundaries is boundaries always lead to conflict or distance. Give us the truth on that one.
Boundaries may create temporary tension, but they lead to deeper connection. At first, setting a boundary can feel uncomfortable, especially if one spouse is used to always pleasing or avoiding conflict. But over time, they foster mutual respect, healthier communication, there's that word again,
Yep.
and lasting emotional safety, which actually strengthens closeness. I really like that. That's a good one.
Yeah. When you have a boundary set there, we know that sometimes those boundaries don't come with icing on them.
Right.
Sometimes we put those boundaries in place that it might upset the other spouse for a temporary span of time, because it may trigger that, well, you don't trust me thought in their mind, of depending on what the situation may be. But as time goes along, we know that healthy boundaries, they do draw you closer.
Yeah.
And that connection, because like we was just talking in the last one, part of building that trust to the most trustfulness that we can have between each other, that does make our connection deeper.
Yeah.
Because the more I trust you, the more I love you.
Yeah.
The more that I feel like I can talk to you about things, the more I feel like I can share stuff with you that I don't share with anybody else. It gets to that intimate side of things where there's stuff that I will not tell anybody, but yet I have a deep enough connection with you because I trust you, because of these boundaries we put in place, and we've kept those boundaries between us to be healthy.
Yeah.
And in a biblical way, I get to a point where I know that I can share anything with you and you're going to understand or help me walk through or talk me through things. And I want to be that person for you.
Yeah.
And so I know that it's easy to want to avoid conflict, especially if you have a personality like I've had in the past. I still don't really like conflict a whole lot, to be honest. But the way that I handle the marriage now with you, I don't have hardly any trouble with that anymore, because me and you do such a good job of talking things out.
Well, I think that's the communication thing.
It is. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, we trust each other so much that we're open and honest about everything. I mean, I say things and I look at you sometimes and I'm like, I know what he's thinking. And then he'll say it. But it's like, we've worked hard. I mean, being married over 20 years and everything we've walked through, marriage is work. It's just work, and it's not like you go to your job every day, it's like a relationship with Christ. It's work.
Yeah.
It's not just handed to you and be like, oh, okay, here you go. It's work.
Yeah.
And communication, boundaries, grace, there's so much in a marriage that you have to have. Yeah. And I'm so thankful, though, that we've walked where we've walked to help us to be where we're at today, though.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can do that from the very beginning and not have to walk what we did, that's awesome. And that's our prayer for everybody.
Yeah. Well, there's that saying that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And unfortunately, in our situation, I feel like that's the mantra that we lived by for so long, because the turnaround in our marriage was when we almost got divorced. Mm-hmm. I mean, it took that to help us to understand how important this relationship really is, how much we really do need to communicate, how much we do need to rely on each other and trust each other. And it just changed the whole aspect of the whole thing at that point, because we almost lost it. And we truly loved each other. Mm-hmm. It was by stupidity that we ended up where we were, and selfishness and a lot of the other things, that goes into all of that. And it shouldn't have taken that to make us turn around and to realize that. And that's one reason we share what we do on our podcast, because especially newlyweds, people that's been married 5-10 years, whatever, you're still kind of in the first parts of your marriage. It's so important that you start working on this stuff from day one.
Yeah.
Don't wait.
Keep God at the center.
Exactly. Yeah, you don't wait until it's too late.
Yeah.
And, a lot of people, if you go into churches and talk to Christians or whatever, the first thing they'll say is, you just need to pray about it because prayer changes things,
And it does.
And it does to an extent, but in all reality, it's not things that prayer changes. Prayer changes people. People changes things. And we always have to keep that in mind, because everything that happens in your life is usually instigated by a person. Yeah. And so if that person does not change, then those things aren't necessarily going to change, because you're still dealing with a person in the middle. And so when you start praying about these things that are going on in your marriages and these bad things that are happening and all that kind of thing, make sure that you not only just pray for yourself, because you should always, pray for yourself first. God, if there's anything in me
Yes.
Forgive me for this. Take care of home base first. But then pray for those other people that are involved, that God would change their hearts. In the process of all of that, the whole scenario changes at that point.
Yeah.
And so that's where these boundaries come into play.
So good.
And there's a lot of good myths that were busted here today on these boundaries. And hopefully one of them resonated with someone out there that's listening if you're having some issues with boundaries. So we're going to go ahead and close up this week's episode with that. On next week's episode, we'll come back and we're going to start going through different areas of boundaries, sexually and spiritually, just different places in our life where we set boundaries and why we do that and how we do that. So we'll talk about that on the next episode that we come back with our marriage episodes here. So in the meantime, though, don't forget that, boundaries in marriage, they're not about control, avoidance, or isolation. They're about creating a relationship where both people are free to love, respect, and grow together without fear, confusion, or resentment. Boundaries are not a sign of division, they're a pathway to deeper unity. In Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23, it sums it all up. It says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it.
Yeah.
How do you guard your heart? You set up boundaries. It's all biblical in how all of this works. Well, is that all you have for this week to add to this? Okay, well, we're going to go ahead then and call this one good. Please subscribe to be sure that you don't miss the next episode that comes along. I'm Daniel Moore, and my wife Michelle has been sitting over here with me this week.
Bye, guys.
And we're going to be back again later on. Thank you for listening. The show really wouldn't be possible without you. If you're a fan of the show, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or if you'd like to help us out, just take a few seconds to give us a 5-star click, and please subscribe to us on your favorite platform. The links are in the show notes. Well, that's all for this week. We pray that your marriage is stronger and your walk with God is closer after this episode. This is an extension of Connecting the Gap Ministries, and we pray that you have a blessed week.
You've been listening to Connecting the Gap podcast. In this world, there are many disconnects that cause chaos in our lives. This podcast is birthed from the desire to share hope and restoration of the power of the gospel by being transparent and open in our biblical walk with God. Each week, we take a few moments as we navigate God's Word and peer into other people's testimonies and encourage each other to connect the gap. We upload a new audio podcast every Thursday and a video version of it on YouTube and Rumble. We are also on the Christian podcasting app, Edify. You can subscribe to our podcast on many of the available podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, TuneIn Radio, and more. We are also available on your Alexa-enabled devices. If you would like to contact our ministry for any reason, visit our contact page and send us a message. We hope you are blessed by this ministry. This is a production of Connecting the Gap Ministries.